The laughter stopped the moment Lemmy Kilmister's weathered fingers touched those acoustic strings. What started as a cruel joke at a backstage party in 1987 became the most heartbreaking moment in rock history, revealing a secret about Lemmy that no one saw coming. It was November 23, 1987, at the Whiskey A Go-Go in Los Angeles. Motorhead had just finished destroying the stage with their trademark ear-splitting performance. The crowd was still buzzing from the sonic assault, and backstage was packed with the usual suspects: musicians, groupies, record executives, and hangers-on, all riding the high of another legendary Motorhead show. The venue itself was legendary, having hosted everyone from the Doors to Led Zeppelin. Tonight, the walls still vibrated from Motorhead's punishing set. They played classics like Ace of Spades and Overkill with their signature wall of sound that could crack concrete. Lemmy's Rickenbacker bass had thundered through the room like artillery fire, while his gravelly voice delivered each lyric like a declaration of war against conformity. Lemmy sat in the corner, nursing his signature Jack and Coke, still dripping sweat from the performance. At 42, he looked like he'd lived 3 lifetimes. The moles on his face were more pronounced under the harsh backstage lighting, his long hair plastered to his skull, his black leather jacket hanging open to reveal the battle-scarred body of a man who'd been at war with the music industry for 2 decades. The party was typical rock and roll excess. Alcohol flowed freely, cigarette smoke created a thick haze, and the conversation was loud and boastful. Musicians were trading war stories, trying to one-up each other with tales of debauchery and musical prowess. Someone was telling a story about trashing a hotel room in Detroit. Another group was arguing about who had the loudest amplifiers. In one corner, a group of record executives were discussing potential signings, their voices lowered but their excitement obvious. The music industry in 1987 was booming, with MTV driving album sales to unprecedented heights. Everyone wanted to find the next big thing, the next band that could capture the energy of what Motorhead had been doing for over a decade. But something felt different tonight. Lemmy seemed quieter than usual. Those who knew him well, Fast Eddie, Motorhead's guitarist, and Phil "Filthy Animal" Taylor, their drummer, noticed that their frontman's typical sardonic commentary was missing. He sat nursing his drink, occasionally nodding when someone spoke to him, but his mind seemed elsewhere. Earlier that day, Lemmy had received a phone call that shook him more than he'd let on. His old friend from Stoke-on-Trent had tracked him down to tell him that they'd found some old letters while cleaning out a deceased relative's house. Letters addressed to Ian Kilmister, Lemmy's real name, from someone named Susan Clarke, dated 1973 and 1974. The letters had never been forwarded, never reached him during those crucial early years of his career. The letters contained news that Susan had been pregnant with his child, that she'd miscarried, that she'd been in a car accident. All things Lemmy never knew, all pain he couldn't share. The weight of that missed connection, that lost love, sat heavy on his shoulders as he watched the party swirl around him. That's when Danny Morrison, the lead singer of a wannabe hair metal band called Velvet Scream, noticed the acoustic guitar leaning against the wall. Danny was young, probably 23, with teased hair and leather pants that were trying too hard to capture the essence of rock and roll rebellion. He'd been trying all night to impress the industry people in the room, but everyone was more interested in talking to the real legends. Danny's band had opened for Motorhead that night, and it hadn't gone well. They were competent musicians, but they lacked the authentic grit that separated real metal from its manufactured imitators. Danny could play all the right notes, hit all the right poses, but something essential was missing. The crowd had been polite but unengaged, marking time until the real show began. "Hey look," Danny announced loudly, pointing at the acoustic guitar. "Someone left their campfire sing-along guitar here." The room chuckled. Acoustic guitars were seen as soft, commercial, the antithesis of everything heavy metal stood for in 1987. This was the era of bigger, louder, faster, when success was measured in decibels and distortion. The idea of a metal musician playing acoustic was seen as selling out, going soft, betraying the cause. But what Danny said next changed everything. "I bet none of these tough guys could play a real song on that thing." Danny continued, his voice getting louder as the alcohol made him bolder. "Especially not Lemmy. Can you imagine? The guy who plays bass like a machine gun, sitting there with an acoustic guitar, trying to play some sensitive ballad." The suggestion was absurd, and everyone knew it. Lemmy Kilmister was the epitome of heavy metal aggression. His bass playing was legendary for its volume, its anger, its complete rejection of anything soft or sentimental. He'd been thrown out of Hawkwind for being too hard-edged. He'd formed Motorhead specifically to be the loudest, fastest, dirtiest band in the world. The idea of him playing acoustic was like asking a hurricane to be gentle. Several people laughed. Someone made a joke about Lemmy playing Kumbaya. Another person suggested he might know some Johnny Cash, but only the prison songs. A woman with teased blonde hair and too much makeup giggled and said she couldn't imagine those rough hands playing anything delicate. But fast Eddie noticed something others missed. When Danny made his comment, something flickered across Lemmy's face. It wasn't anger, exactly, and it wasn't amusement. It was something deeper, more complicated. Eddie had known Lemmy since 1975, had watched him through binges and breakdowns, through triumph and disaster. He recognized that look. It was the look of a man remembering something painful. Then Danny made his fatal mistake. "Come on, Lemmy," Danny called out across the room, raising his beer bottle in a mock toast. "Show us your sensitive side. Play us a love song on the acoustic guitar. I bet you can't even hold it properly." The room went quiet. Danny had crossed a line, challenging a legend in front of his peers. This wasn't friendly banter anymore. This was disrespect. In the hierarchy of rock and roll, Danny was a nobody challenging a king. Several people looked uncomfortable. Even the record executives stopped their conversation to watch. Lemmy looked up slowly. His dark eyes, usually sharp and alert, seemed to cloud over for just a moment. Everyone expected him to either ignore the punk kid or deliver one of his famously cutting verbal responses. Lemmy was known for his wit, his ability to destroy hecklers with a single sentence. He could eviscerate someone verbally and make them thank him for it. Instead, something unexpected happened. Lemmy stood up and walked toward the acoustic guitar. The conversation stopped. People turned to watch, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Fast Eddie looked concerned. Phil "Filthy Animal" Taylor, their drummer, raised an eyebrow. Sharon, Danny's girlfriend, tugged at his sleeve, suddenly aware that her boyfriend might have pushed too far. Lemmy picked up the acoustic guitar, a well-worn Martin D28 that belonged to the club. As he held it, testing its weight, something in his posture changed. The aggressive stance he maintained on stage with his Rickenbacker bass softened. He looked almost vulnerable. The guitar showed its age. The finish was worn smooth in places where countless hands had held it. There were small dings and scratches that spoke of years of use. Someone had carved initials near the sound hole. RL plus MK 1982. A small declaration of love immortalized in wood. For a moment, Lemmy traced those letters with his finger. "You want a love song?" Lemmy said quietly, his gravelly voice barely audible over the background noise. "I'll give you a love song." But nobody was prepared for what came next. Lemmy sat down on a nearby amp, cradled the acoustic guitar properly, and began to tune it with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this many times before. His fingers, scarred from decades of aggressive bass playing, moved delicately across the tuning pegs. Each adjustment was careful, precise. This wasn't someone fumbling with an unfamiliar instrument. The room was completely silent now. Even the bartender had stopped washing glasses. The only sounds were the gentle pings of the tuning pegs being adjusted and the distant noise of traffic on Sunset Strip. As Lemmy tuned, his whole demeanor changed. The swagger was gone. The aggressive posture melted away. In its place sat a man who looked older, wearier, carrying burdens that the stage persona was designed to hide. This was Ian Kilmister, not Lemmy. This was the man beneath the legend. Then Lemmy began to play. The first notes were gentle, melancholic. It wasn't any song anyone recognized. The chord progression was simple but haunting. A, F, C, G, played with a finger-picking pattern that spoke of hours of private practice. It was beautiful and sad, played with a tenderness that seemed impossible from the same hands that had just pummeled a bass guitar into submission. And then Lemmy began to sing. His voice, usually a grinding roar that could cut through a wall of distortion, was soft, almost whispery. The transformation was stunning. This wasn't a voice that had growled through Bomber and Iron Fist. This was something entirely different, vulnerable and broken and beautiful. The words came out like a confession. There was a girl in Stoke-on-Trent who loved me when I had nothing to give. She held my hand when the world was bent, taught me what it meant to live. The song was beautiful, heartbreaking, and completely unlike anything Lemmy had ever recorded. The melody was haunting, built on simple chord changes that allowed the lyrics to carry the emotional weight. But it was the emotion in his voice that stopped everyone's breath. Fast Eddie moved closer, his eyes wide. He'd known Lemmy for over a decade, had toured with him across the world, had seen him at his highest and lowest points. But he'd never heard him sing like this. This wasn't performance. This was confession. The other musicians in the room began to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't a drunk rock star making a fool of himself. This was an artist revealing his soul. Several people reached for drinks they no longer wanted, nervous habits in the face of such raw emotion. Then came the revelation that shattered everyone's assumptions. Susan was her name, Sweet Susan Clarke. She waited for me every night. But I chose the road, chose the dark, left her standing in the light. The story unfolded through the song. Susan Clarke had been Lemmy's girlfriend in the early 1970s, before Motorhead, before the fame, when he was just Ian Kilmister, struggling musician from Stoke-on-Trent. She believed in him when no one else did, supported his dream of making it in music. She'd worked extra shifts at the local factory to help pay for his equipment, had sat through countless rehearsals in cold, damp basements, had been there through the rejections and disappointments. She said, "Come back when you've found your way." I promised her I'd make it right. But success came with a price to pay, and I lost her to the night. The song revealed that Lemmy had written this acoustic piece in 1975 after learning that Susan had died in a car accident while he was on tour with Motorhead's first lineup. He'd been in Germany, playing to crowds of a few hundred people, building the legend that would eventually conquer the world. Meanwhile, the woman who'd made it all possible had been buried in a small cemetery in Staffordshire, with only her family present. He'd never shared the song with anyone, never recorded it, never performed it. It was too personal, too painful. The weight of success felt hollow when the person who'd believed in him first wasn't there to see it. I got the call in Dortmund town. The phone was ringing in my hotel room. Her mother's voice breaking down. "Ian, she's gone. Taken too soon." This verse wasn't part of the original song. Lemmy was adding details, memories spilling out as he played. The room could feel his pain, the weight of years of carrying this guilt. Success had come, but at what cost? By now, several people in the room were crying. Sharon, Danny's girlfriend, had tears streaming down her face. She understood now what her boyfriend had stumbled into. This wasn't about proving toughness or sensitivity. This was about love and loss and the choices we make that we can never undo. Even some of the tough-looking roadies were wiping their eyes. These were men who'd seen everything, who'd dealt with the chaos and violence that followed rock tours around the world. But this raw honesty cut through all their defenses. Danny Morrison, who had started this whole thing as a joke, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The cocky smirk was gone, replaced by genuine shame. He'd meant to humiliate a legend, and instead had opened a wound that had never properly healed. But Lemmy wasn't finished. He was lost in the song now, in the memories, giving voice to pain he'd carried silently for over a decade. Now I play these songs for crowds that scream. But the only voice I want to hear is calling from a broken dream, saying, "Ian, wish you were here." The use of his real name, Ian, instead of Lemmy made it even more personal. This wasn't the Prince of Darkness singing. This was a man mourning the road not taken, the love he'd sacrificed for his career, the crowds that screamed his name, the success he'd achieved, all of it felt hollow compared to losing Susan. The final verse destroyed everyone in the room. Asterisk, so when you see me on that stage, playing loud to hide the pain, remember I was young once, remember I was brave. Before the music drove me insane. Every song's a letter I can't send. Every chord's a word I should have said, to a girl who loved me till the end. Now she's just a voice inside my head. Asterisk. When Lemmy played the final chord, letting it ring out until it faded to nothing, the silence in the room was deafening. He sat there for a moment, still holding the guitar, his head bowed. Then he looked up, and everyone could see the tears in his eyes. "That's your love song," he said quietly to Danny. "Happy now?" What happened next surprised everyone even more. Danny Morrison, the cocky kid who had challenged Lemmy as a joke, walked across the room. His girlfriend Sharon watched in amazement as her usually arrogant boyfriend showed genuine humility for perhaps the first time in his life. Without saying a word, Danny got down on his knees in front of Lemmy. "I'm sorry," Danny said, his voice shaking. "I had no idea. I was being stupid. I'm so sorry." Lemmy looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "We've all been stupid, kid. That's how we learn." Fast Eddie approached his bandmate, his own eyes wet. "Lemmy mate," he said softly. "Why have you never?" "Because it hurts too much," Lemmy replied simply. "Some songs are meant to be private. Some pain doesn't need an audience." The party atmosphere was completely gone now. People were having quiet conversations, processing what they'd witnessed. Several musicians were looking at their own instruments differently, wondering what songs were hidden inside them, what truths they'd been afraid to tell. But the story was far from over. Word of what happened at the whiskey spread through the rock community like wildfire. Within days, musicians who had been at the party were calling friends, describing what they'd witnessed. The story grew, as these stories do, but the core remained the same. Lemmy Kilmister, the hardest man in rock and roll, had revealed his broken heart through an acoustic guitar. 3 months later, at a small venue in Manchester, someone in the audience shouted for Lemmy to play the Susan song. He pretended not to hear, launching instead into Killed by Death, with extra aggression. But after the show, Fast Eddie found him sitting alone in the dressing room with an acoustic guitar someone had left behind, playing those same chords. "You should record it," Fast Eddie suggested gently. Lemmy shook his head. "Some things are sacred, Eddie. The moment you put it on an album, it becomes a product." Susan deserves better than that. The song became legendary in the rock world, but remained unreleased. Over the years, bootleg recordings surfaced from that night at the Whiskey. The sound quality was terrible, recorded on someone's handheld cassette recorder, but the emotion was crystal clear. It became one of the most sought-after bootlegs in rock history, traded among collectors and passed from fan to fan like a sacred relic. Danny Morrison later said that hearing Lemmy play that song changed his entire approach to music. His band, Velvet Scream, evolved from generic hair metal into something more honest and emotional. They never achieved the commercial success they'd originally sought, but they found something more valuable: authenticity. "I realized that night that being tough doesn't mean being heartless," Danny said in interviews years later. "The strongest guys are the ones brave enough to show their pain. Lemmy taught me that real rock and roll comes from truth, not from trying to look cool." Sharon, who had cried during the performance, left Danny 6 months later. But she stayed in the music industry, eventually becoming a successful music journalist. She wrote about that night years later in Rolling Stone. "I understood then why Lemmy was such a powerful performer. All that aggression, all that volume, it wasn't about anger. It was about loss. He was playing so loud to drown out the silence left behind by the people he'd loved and lost." In 2015, just months before his death, Lemmy finally talked about that night. "I never intended to share that song," he said in one of his final interviews, sitting in his cluttered apartment above the Rainbow Bar and Grill on Sunset Strip. The walls were covered with Nazi memorabilia and Western artifacts, the collections of a man fascinated by history and conflict. "But that young punk pissed me off, and sometimes when you're pissed off, you tell the truth whether you want to or not." Susan would have laughed at the whole thing. "She always said I took myself too seriously." He paused, taking a sip from his ever-present Jack and Coke, the drink that had sustained him through 5 decades of rock and roll excess. "But I'm glad it happened. People need to know that you can be hard as nails and still have a heart. You can be the loudest, toughest bastard in the room and still love someone so much it breaks you. That's not weakness. That's being human." The impact of that night extended far beyond rock music. The story inspired other musicians to share their vulnerable sides. Acoustic performances became more common at metal shows, not as jokes, but as moments of genuine emotion. Bands like Metallica would later release entire acoustic albums, following a path that Lemmy had inadvertently pioneered that night at the Whiskey. The idea that sensitivity and strength could coexist became more accepted in a genre that had previously valued only aggression. Young musicians learned that authenticity trumped posturing, that showing your scars could be more powerful than pretending you had none. Today, the acoustic guitar from that night at the Whiskey A Go Go is displayed in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. The placard reads, "The guitar that revealed Lemmy's heart. November 23, 1987. Sometimes the most powerful moments come from the most unexpected places." Danny Morrison eventually became a successful producer, known for helping young musicians find the emotional core of their music. He worked with everyone from grunge bands in the 90s to indie artists in the 2000s, always emphasizing the importance of honesty in art. He still tells the story of that night, always emphasizing how Lemmy's vulnerability taught him more about rock and roll than any textbook ever could. And somewhere in Stoke-on-Trent, there's a small memorial stone for Susan Clarke. Lemmy had it placed there secretly in 1988, using money from Motorhead's tour profits. The inscription reads simply, "She believed in the music before anyone else did." Every year on the anniversary of her death, someone leaves flowers there. The locals never figured out who, but those who knew the story always suspected it was a certain legendary bassist, making his quiet pilgrimage to honor the girl who taught him what it meant to love and lose. The joke that was supposed to humiliate Lemmy Kilmister instead revealed the depth of his humanity. It showed a room full of hard-living rock stars that vulnerability isn't the opposite of strength, it's the source of it. Sometimes the most powerful moments come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, when someone asks you to play a love song as a joke, the best response is to play one that's true.